The hardest moment for a farmer isn't when the money runs out. It's when he realizes a year earlier cows had crowded that fence line, animals his father had known by sight. The farm still stretched across 72 acres of red clay. Hannah, his wife, kept the books, and one night she turned the laptop. The chicken house had been part of Cedar Hollow for generations. Each morning he passed the empty cattle lot, stepped around the bucket catching rainwater inside the hen house, and listened to 360 birds. But the next clue to saving Cedar Hollow wasn't hidden in a bank. One afternoon in town, Ethan Cole pulled up. The contradiction lodged in his mind. The store was paying to get rid of organic material. Cedar Hollow was paying heavily to buy nutrition. By the end of the week, Ethan had spoken. Soon his pickup was returning to the farm with boxes of discarded fruits and vegetables instead of empty space. For a few days, the idea felt almost too easy. The hens rushed the peaches, pecked through tomatoes, and tore into leafy greens with enthusiasm. Ethan thought he had finally found the break he needed. Then, reality caught up. The produce spoiled fast. Much of it. That afternoon, Ethan unloaded another stack of expensive feed bags beside crates of free produce, but the answer Ethan needed would come from a place he never expected. And it would sound. Marissa listened without interrupting, then asked. She explained only enough to make him curious. That night, Ethan sat beneath the harsh shop light in the equipment shed with university extension papers spread across an old workbench. The more he read, the stranger and more logical the idea became. Black soldier fly larvae could consume organic waste rapidly and convert part of it into insect biomass rich in protein and fat. Something poultry could actually. Ethan leaned back and looked toward the crates of bruised. But the idea that had looked so promising under a shop. He rebuilt the drainage, only to lose another batch when North Carolina heat pushed the enclosure too hot. Then came the smell. One night, a raccoon tore through the mesh and scattered larvae. A few days later, Ray Dobbins stopped by, looked in the enclosure and grinned. So now you're raising bugs to feed chickens? By the weekend, people at the local. Then one evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table and added up what he had spent on starter larvae, lumber. The next morning, he walked into the shed intending. The tiny patch Ethan almost threw away changed everything. Because from that morning on, he stopped treating the larvae like a desperate experiment and started treating them like livestock. Instead of building more bins, he bought a spiral notebook and began recording everything. Pounds of grocery waste added, temperature, moisture, drainage, larvae harvested, days between generations, and how much chicken feed the farm still purchased. At first, the pages looked messy, but patterns slowly appeared. Wet peaches and tomatoes needed to be mixed with. Drainage had to move liquid away before it pooled. One evening, while flipping through his notes, Ethan remembered the small farm. Then came the first moment that felt like proof. But everything Ethan had built would mean nothing if the reaction was immediate. The hens rushed forward, scratching, pecking, and chasing the larvae with an intensity Ethan had not seen in months. Their natural foraging instincts seemed to switch back on. But Ethan had learned enough by then not to mistake excitement for proof. He kept recording the numbers: bags of commercial feed purchased, eggs collected each day, flock condition, and the amount of larvae coming out of the bins. Days turned into weeks. Then Hannah noticed something before he did. The stack of feed bags against the barn wall was shrinking far more slowly. Months earlier, Ethan had watched those bags disappear almost as fast as he could buy them. Now the same number lasted noticeably longer, while egg production remained steady and the hens stayed active and healthy. Hannah checked the invoices twice, then called Ethan into the kitchen. The savings were no longer theoretical. They were showing up on the farm's actual bills. Ethan expanded carefully, refusing to outrun the system that had taken so long to stabilize. When Ray Dobbins stopped by again, he stood beside the chicken yard and watched the hens tear through another feeding. This time, there was no grin, no joke about the bug barn. After a long silence, Ray asked, "How much feed are you actually saving?" Ethan looked at him and realized the question itself was a victim. A week later, Marissa Bennett returned to inspect the notebook, compare feed purchases with egg numbers, and review the larvae output. She didn't call it a miracle. She simply said the records showed a real change. Cedar Hollow had finally crossed the line from experiment to proof. And Ethan was about to discover that saving money on feed was only. But the biggest surprise came after Ethan had already solved the problem he thought would save Cedar Hollow, because suddenly the farm was producing more larvae than 360 hens could possibly eat. At first, he gave the surplus to a nearby poultry keeper who had heard about the bug barn. A week later, the man came back asking for more. Then another small farmer called, then a homesteader. Ethan began selling modest quantities of live larvae, and before long people were asking for dried larvae. Even the crumbly material left behind after the larvae finished feeding turned out to have value as a soil amendment. And Hannah started bagging. The grocery store benefited too. Every crate Ethan hauled away meant less organic material headed toward disposal. And soon a second store called him, then a third. Months earlier, Ethan had searched for anyone willing to let him take damaged produce. Now, he sometimes had to say. When a lender suggested financing a much larger facility, Ethan declined. He had already learned what happened when enthusiasm outran understanding. Instead, he added one bin at a time. But the final proof of Ethan's transformation didn't come from a spreadsheet. It came from the man who had laughed first. Nearly 2 years after Ethan's first failed colony, Cedar Hollow still looked like the same modest North Carolina farm. The farmhouse was weathered, the red clay driveway still washed after rain, and the barn still needed repairs. Then Ray Dobbins returned carrying a notebook and measurements from his shed. He studied Ethan's bins and asked, "If I built one, where would you put the drainage?" Ethan didn't mention the old jokes. He simply showed him what he had learned. Later, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with the books open. Months earlier, she had dreaded showing Ethan the numbers. Now she pointed to the bottom line and smiled. Back in town, another cart of bruised produce rolled toward a loading dock while shoppers passed without noticing. Ethan hadn't saved the farm by finding something no one had seen. He saved it by seeing a connection others ignored. One person's waste could become another farmer's resource. Sometimes a second chance doesn't come from more land, debt, or machinery. It comes from seeing value before everyone else does. If stories like this stay with you, subscribe to Solace Farm Stories and tell us below, would you have seen trash